Welcome back. This is the 19th segment out of 63 in our series that we're calling Because It's True, making the case for Christianity in bite-sized pieces. Working from an apologetic model, which is skeletal at first, with three prongs: philosophical, historical, and experiential. We have begun putting some flesh on this skeleton, first of all, of course, with the philosophical. In other words, what might we reasonably expect an individual to reasonably conclude concerning the existence of God if that person thinks about all that is observable around him in the natural world? Now, on this prong, the first slab of flesh that we put on it was the argument from design, the teleological argument. The second slab of flesh that we have been putting on this philosophical prong is the moral argument. And basically the bottom line to that is that if we are to be able to speak meaningfully concerning right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust, then there has to be a transcendent standard of morality which each of us is responsible to. Otherwise, we're the best that we've got. And any conclusions that you come up with are just as good as any conclusions that I come up with. And who's to say who's correct? Who's to say who's incorrect? Who's to say what I do is wrong? Who's to say what you do is wrong or right? The terms no longer have any meaning because right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust become relative, subjective, subject to each particular individual. But what we have said is that you can't live that way. Observation will show us, thinking should lead us to the understanding that morality is something that we all have a sense of. Thus, it is a strong clue that there really is absolute morality, and if there is absolute morality, a transcendent standard beyond you and me, that points to God, a lawgiver. And we are aware on some level of morality of that law. Now, in making that case, last segment, I paraphrased largely from the case that C.S. Lewis makes in his book, Mere Christianity, which is actually a compilation of 3 different books, which is actually transcribed from a number of radio talks that he gave. And this case that he makes concerning morality being evidence of the existence of God is in the first part of Mere Christianity, the first book of Mere Christianity, called The Case for Christianity. And yes, indeed, I have a hardback copy published in 1944. So, those of you who are fellow C.S. Lewis lovers, eat your hearts out. Let me just share with you right quickly how Lewis wraps up this argument. Here's what he says, and I will be reading from my 1944 hardback copy of The Case for Christianity. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe to when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be a part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because a man isn't a water mammal. A fish wouldn't feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust. Not that it just didn't happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God didn't exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning.